And I'm going to introduce our last guest of the whole conference. No pressure. Matt Marshall, Executive Director of Redwood Coast Energy Authority. He's going to talk about resources, techniques, and strategies for North Coast energy independence. Welcome, Matthew.
I'm assuming you're all here because you didn't want to hurt my feelings, so I appreciate that. And it's interesting to have the last presentation of the day, and be the closer for the day, and be talking about energy at what was started as a water group, and so maybe that's kind of an indication of the new name and a new direction as far as adding other resources and looking at other ways that we can regionally collaborate. So I'm just going to go over kind of the big picture of how we use energy in the region, what are our energy needs, and then look at sort of a process for saying, well, how can we meet those needs from local resources, and particularly the process that we've been looking at here in Humboldt County, and then kind of look at some of the strategies that we've identified from our work as far as moving forward with implementing those kind of energy independence programs. And certainly Grant just covered some of the great things they're doing in Sonoma County, which we get jealous about quite regularly. So just a little bit about the Energy Authority. We're a local government joint powers agency that represents Humboldt County, all the incorporated cities within the county, including our host, Fortuna, as well as the Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District. We've been around for 10 years, and our mission is really to reduce energy use, increase energy efficiency, and advance the use of clean, renewable resources that are available in the region. And we've been doing that for 10 years now, and there's the saying that the 10 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." And so we really try to take that seriously and try to craft programs that benefit the community. And our staff of 25, most of them are field folks that go out and work directly with businesses, primarily small businesses and homeowners, and really try to implement energy efficiency projects at the community level, because there's tons of opportunity, and big corporations and large businesses usually take advantage of those, and they've got the staff and the resources to figure out what the opportunities are and how to really leverage those opportunities, whereas mom and pop businesses just are spending 26 hours a day trying to keep their business running, and they don't have the time and the expertise and the capacity to really even identify the opportunities, let alone implement them. So we really go out and try to make it kind of turnkey programs that support businesses and homes, and work with local contractors so that the work gets done by local small businesses, and really kind of focus on the economic development side of it, which in energy is nice because it's easy to quantify savings, and so it's nice for us to be able to go and say, for every dollar that our programs cost, we're saving multiple dollars in the community. And so it's a pretty simple calculation to be able to show those results, as long as we're doing it right and achieving those savings. So just as far as talking about the region, one thing, the state does not track energy use on the watershed level, so I had to kind of divvy it up by counties. And so looking at Siskiyou down through Sonoma County, and just the fact that you guys know that we're a large part of the state, but we're quite rural, and our population is a very small slice of it. And then within that, though, there's quite a bit of diversity. The lion's share of the population is down in Sonoma County. And so, obviously, like Trinity and Siskiyou are rich in many resources, but population density is not one of them. So even within our region, though we're overall rural, that there's still diversity here. And I'm just going to show some energy, info for the region as a whole, as far as collectively. And I didn't break it out by county, because you can pretty much just use this pie chart to break it out. It tracks pretty closely to population. And so, whenever you're looking at one of these numbers, you can say, well, okay, Sonoma's going to be about 60%, Humboldt's going to be about 17%. There's some variation, like more diesel use in Siskiyou County, for example, because of trucking and the more rural nature of it. So there's some differences in the proportions, but basically it splits out in that. So I didn't add extra pie charts since I got plenty of them already. So this is just kind of the overall energy use of how we use energy, and the end use consumption of energy. And you can see that the transportation fuels are the biggest part of that. More than half is really to move ourselves around in vehicles. And then we've got natural gas and electricity. I had to kind of guesstimate the propane number, because that's not something that the state doesn't track propane and fuel oil. And Siskiyou, Del Norte, and much of Trinity and Humboldt, actually, they don't have access to natural gas service. So it's a mystery number, but looking at population and what natural gas use is per capita, it's somewhere in that range. And so, that's kind of the end use of, what we're using to fuel, our vehicles, to heat our homes, for industrial processes, the electricity we're using in homes and businesses. That's kind of our needs in, British thermal units to kind of normalize it between fuel types, which isn't really a number that probably means anything. I don't think anyone thinks in British thermal units. Even energy nerds don't tend to, at least I don't. And so I broke it out by cost, and the pie chart changes a little bit when you look at different ways of slicing and dicing it, but overall it's about $2.6 billion a year in the cost of what we're spending on energy as a community. And you can see electricity is a little bit more expensive, and the vehicle fuels are expensive energy forms, and so those kind of grew in the pie chart, whereas natural gas, shrunk proportionately as far as the cost share. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that our electricity comes from natural gas, so you're burning natural gas to make electricity, and there's losses in that, so electricity by its nature is going to be a more expensive fuel type. But that $2.6 billion a year is quite a lot, and most of that's leaving the community. We're not producing too much natural gas. The Eel River Valley produces about 10% of what we use in Humboldt County, and the rest is piped in here in Humboldt County. We're not producing a lot of vehicle fuels, and so we're dependent on outside inputs, and so we're sending that money out of the community. And obviously that's a big factor in the economy. People talk about the medical marijuana or the non-medical marijuana industry or the underground economy of Humboldt, and that's hard to estimate, but a lot of the estimates I've heard are in the $400 to $500 million a year in economic activity, and that's about what we spend on energy in Humboldt County. And so really our energy expenditures are kind of in that same scale as our #1 underground economy activity here in Humboldt. And so, looking at that is, really how can we reduce that sort of leakage of dollars from our community? And, even saying, well, what if, 1% of that $2.6 billion was staying in the community and coming from local sources and recirculating, that's adding up to, tens of millions of dollars, even just from 1 or 2% keeping it local rather than sending money to PG&E or oil companies where we're getting our energy supply. And then, another way to slice it and dice it would just be to look at those same sources from greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a little similar to the primary energy use. And again, it's also kind of worth noting that electricity gets a lot of the attention, and we spend a lot of our time looking at electricity. But it's really, only 20% of the issue, and transportation fuels are kind of a big challenge, and it's a hard one to deal with, but it's sometimes I think people kind of ignore them because they don't want to deal with it, and it's easier to focus on, facilities and generation projects and then trying to crack the transportation nut. And people don't generally think of things in million metric tons of CO2 either, but I think that figure's useful because Marcia had her slide of that that year 1999 when there was over 12 million metric tons of CO2 emitted from local forest fires in Humboldt, Del Norte, and Trinity. And so for that 1 year, that was more than twice all the emissions from the 800,000 people that live in our region. And so that kind of puts it in perspective of, just that one big fire year can really, even if we eliminated all of our emissions for 2 years, that can undo that. And so really looking at, not just addressing our cost side of things, but the fire issue really does play into greenhouse gas emissions in a major way. That doesn't necessarily reduce the millions of dollars or billions of dollars we're spending on energy, but it's a good context for that. So in Humboldt County, we kind of said, well, okay, this is what we need. These are the energy sources that we're dependent on to run our economy. Where are we getting that from now? Where is that coming from currently? And then what are our options to move that to local sources and to have it be an opportunity for economic development? And so we undertook a project which we called Repower Humboldt, and we had some funding from the California Energy Commission to do a sort of strategic planning process to look at, could we get 75 to 100% of our electricity from local renewables here in Humboldt County? It was focused on electricity because that's what the grant program was about, and so that's sort of a caveat. That was the lens we were looking through, and one of the key findings of it was, one, that it's actually quite possible to get to that 75 and 100%. It's technically possible with current technology to do that in Humboldt County at minimal or potentially no cost increase. The other part was, which you could guess from those pie charts, was if you're looking at greenhouse gas reductions, electricity isn't necessarily the most cost-effective place to focus. Or if you are focusing on renewable electricity, how can you also move transportation through either fuel cells or through electric vehicles to take advantage of that renewable electricity and get off of imported oil? And so, that was kind of some of the key findings that came out of it. The process really involved a lot of technical analysis and modeling, working with the Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State University, as well as PG&E. And then we did a lot of economic analysis to look at what would be the costs, what would be the job creation benefits or impacts, and then also kind of a process of stakeholder and public engagement to really, not have it be done sort of in an academic way, but to get input from the community and relevant folks in the forestry sector and in, the private sector. So, talking to bankers and timber guys, as well as environmental folks and regulators. This is one of our stakeholder meetings that we had back in, well, I guess it was the end of 2010 when I was just first starting at the Energy Authority. So kind of looking at all those different pieces of it, of not just the technical side, but the kind of community side of it. So this is, for Humboldt County, this is currently where we get our electricity. And you can see about half of it is the Humboldt Bay Power Plant, which is natural gas fired. Then about a third of it comes from our 3 local biomass power plants. So we're already pretty heavily taking advantage of the local biomass resource. There's a section that's imports, and then there's some that's hydropower and a little bit of photovoltaics. And we actually don't have the ability to import power enough to meet our demand in Humboldt County, so we're dependent on these local generators that, the Humboldt Bay Power Plant really is designed to be able to meet our local needs and ramp up and down to match that, which is nice because it also can ramp up and down very easily to match renewable intermittent generation. So if there was to be a lot of wind or wave, they actually repowered that power plant a few years back with that in mind to be able to say, what, they've got these 10 like battleship engines that they can ramp one or all of them up or down so that they can really follow the load, and then if there was intermittent renewables, they could adapt to that really quickly and say, oh, the wind's blowing, all right, we'll ramp them down. Oh, the wind dies down, we can ramp them up. And so we were fortunate that PG&E invested in their facility that way. It really helps us kind of actually seriously consider this kind of high penetration of renewables. So we did a modeling activity where we looked at what would be the sort of overall resource potential, looking at what we've got right now, and then what are the resources we have available in the county that could be expanded. And so the kind of looking out to like 2030, that there's a fair amount of wind potential. For the study, we mostly looked at onshore wind, which is just out in that direction, on that hill there. But there's also a lot of offshore wind potential, as well as wave potential. Both of those are kind of unproven or early stage technologies that are moving along a little faster in other areas like Oregon and on the East Coast and certainly in Europe, but California is lagging a bit on the offshore wind and wave, so that's one of the priorities we're looking at, as well as the potential to expand biomass. We've been talking a lot about the forestry issues, and so there's that resource that is available potentially. And then looking also at small, like run-of-river style hydro systems and solar. And those are pretty much the same resources that are going to be available across our whole region. Obviously, offshore wind and wave are not going to be available inland. And there's geothermal resources down in Sonoma, as well as the Northeast, that we don't have here in Humboldt. But with those exceptions, it's kind of fairly consistent opportunities across the region. And so the folks at HSU basically took all these potential expansions and looked at what the costs of developing them are, and built a model that could run different scenarios and try to optimize it for different parameters, whether reducing cost, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and kind of seeing what resource mix would achieve that. And this is just kind of a little snapshot of that modeling activity. So this is like 1 week they were doing it for like a year in 2030, and they ran this model over and over again. So the dark line that kind of runs through the top middle section is the actual energy needs of Humboldt County based off of like hourly PG&E data. And then the different colored bars represent all the different renewable resources or the natural gas power plant, both the current existing resources as well as potential build out. And so this was one modeling run. This is 1 week of it. And you can see it kind of matches. There's the base load of biomass and hydro. And then you've got the light blue is wind. And there's solar on there that's orange, which is kind of small because this is November. And the solar guys always give me a hard time about that because we picked a fall month. And so it doesn't show solar very big. And then the red you can see is kind of topping off in those areas where the renewables don't meet that black line. The natural gas power plant can fill in those gaps. And again, that's actually technically possible because of the plant we have here in Humboldt. And then those areas where the light blue is exceeding the black line, those would be periods of export. And so, the model obviously, because we've got limited export, we couldn't just build out a bunch of wind and say we're done, because we couldn't, there would be wasted energy that wouldn't even be able to be exported. And so that was a big part of the optimization, was running the model and looking at, how could we really meet it. And so the outputs of that, here's kind of some example scenarios that I'll just touch on quickly. The business as usual scenario is kind of our current, where we're getting our energy, mostly natural gas. We've got that chunk of biomass, some hydro, and then we've got efficiency in there as far as reducing demand, the programs that we're already doing. And then the model kind of looked at allowing for a 5% cost increase and a 15% cost increase. And I should caveat that with that was assuming current technology, kind of current prices. It was also not assuming a price on carbon, which is changing here in California with cap and trade. And so fairly conservative assumptions. But even with that, for pretty moderate increases, we could get up to over 70% renewables. A lot of that would be increasing biomass, small hydro, and wind, and then get up to almost 100% for a fairly modest increase. Obviously efficiency is usually the cheapest thing, so that kind of gets throttled out. And then looking at significant more biomass, wind, and then potentially some wave. And this is just one scenario. I mean, it wasn't dependent, like you had to do this exact mix for it to work, that there was some variability. If you said, well, what if we don't have wave? What if wave never comes along? And that could shift, or you could shift between biomass and wind some. So there was definitely, multiple options for it, but a key finding was that you did need multiple resources. You couldn't just build out one resource. So as far as strategies of how do we kind of, move forward with this, it was clear that it was technically quite possible. There wasn't technological barriers to doing this, but it's like, well, why isn't it happening? And what are the next steps to actually do it? And so, a key, strategy that was identified was, well, there's this big biomass resource, and it's, been identified, and you can kind of add up, what's the potential there, but it's not being tapped, and, really, it's coming from that, forest fuels reduction type of resource. The mill waste is already pretty much being utilized fully locally here. And so how do you really get to that? And I think one of the priorities that we kind of focused on was letting restoration kind of guide it and say, let's address forest fires and figure out how do we deal with that, how do we focus on that, and then design energy projects that are going to meet that demand, as opposed to trying to build an energy project and say, well, okay, now where can we get fuel for this energy project, to really have it be back engineered from the restoration side of it. And there's some technical challenges to that besides the logistical challenges. I think Nick on Wednesday did a good job of describing how complex biomass can be. Another key strategy is kind of at the distributed energy efficiency local level, because those are often the projects with sort of the highest payback and the best economics. The challenge is that it's very distributed and it's at the grassroots level, and so looking at opportunities for waste to energy, such as dairy digesters, and even municipal waste like food waste digesters, which our local waste management authority is looking at doing a project, as well as kind of the community campaign level of if you want to do energy efficiency or solar, that's really in individual houses, individual businesses. So you've really got to get out there into the community. It's got to be a decentralized activity. And financing is key, and Sonoma has a great example of a financing program that enables people to get over that upfront cost barrier, because it doesn't matter how great the rate of return is on a project. If you don't have the money to invest in it, you can't invest in it. And so having those opportunities to work with individuals is really key for those distributed resources that have to kind of take place out in the community and not at centralized locations. The other piece is research and development, and particularly on the biomass side, that's a key one as far as the small-scale technology that can be paired appropriately with restoration activities is something that's struggling, and it's really in the early stages, and so that's one of the areas we're focusing on. We're just starting a project with a grant from the state to do a biomass system with the Blue Lake Rancheria to look at new technologies to kind of scale it down to the facility size to better match up with those restoration needs rather than building large central facilities. And then certainly the areas of offshore wind and wave are technologies that need development and exploration to really reach their potential. That's a time-lapsed picture of a tether-based little wind glider. So it's a wind generation unit that has a tether and it sort of spins around and has generators on it. That's a company out of the Bay Area that we've been working with. They're interested in maybe doing some testing up here. And they actually just got bought by Google, so we'll see how that goes for them. And then another kind of component of that is the purchasing side of it, of you can build a generation project, but how is that being sold to PG&E? Is it being sold to another utility? And so programs like community choice aggregation, which has been touched on a few times, is a great way to not only build those resources, but have them be used by the community and have them used locally and take the economic benefits of that locally. And then there's other options as well, like the utilities are rolling out green power programs where it would be more of a utility model that would sort of be the utility flavor of community choice aggregation, where they would build local renewables, ideally local renewables, that then people could kind of sign up and subscribe to and maybe have a 2-cent premium on their bill per kilowatt hour. And that's not quite as ideal as perhaps community choice aggregation, but it's maybe a simpler option since they're going to be rolling those programs out. And then on the kind of more individual facility size, There's power purchase agreements where you can contract with an entity to build and operate a system on your facility and buy power from them rather than being the entity that builds it themselves and capitalizes that. So there's definitely options on the sort of economic side of it to have projects be locally used from the power consumption side of it. The transportation piece, one of the areas we're trying to focus more on is looking at electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure as well as other alternative fuels to really start addressing that piece of the puzzle more. And especially in a rural area, it's hard to do public transportation. People can't bike 50 miles a day if you're in a really rural area. And so, compared to urban areas where the focus is much more on public transportation, I think it's tough to get out of our cars, and especially in bad weather in Humboldt County and in rural areas. And so looking at what are options for other fuels that are coming from local sources. And then just last up, there's a lot of funding that's coming available for these kinds of programs. The Public Utility Commission has about $1 billion a year in funding that they put towards energy efficiency programs, and that's where a lot of our program funding that we work in the community with comes from. It's administered by the utilities, which is a challenge since only PG&E territory is really affected by that, so a big part of our region doesn't come under that, the jurisdiction of that program. That's a pretty complex and ongoing program. It's changing in 2015. They're looking at kind of revamping it, so it'll be interesting to see how that shapes up. And we certainly advocate for more local control of those dollars and more kind of local implementation, especially for rural areas that often get left out of that $1 billion funding picture, and it goes a lot of times to urban areas. The California Energy Commission has their electric program investment charge and alternative fuels programs, which have investment programs. I think the EPIC program is about $130 million a year that's going to be towards research and development for generation technologies. And then the alternative fuels program is about $100 million a year for infrastructure, vehicle incentives. And so those are both programs that are competitive grant programs that regionally or locally we can compete for. Proposition 39 is going to be about $430 million. It's pretty much all going to schools, but we've all got schools. And so that's an opportunity to really kind of support the best use of that, and we're certainly working with our local schools to help them implement that funding, which is a pretty big chunk and has a lot of opportunity associated with it. And then perhaps the most interesting of all these is the cap and trade auction revenue, which is looking to maybe be $500 million a year for programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the state borrowed this year's $500 million, and they're going to repay it, and so there'll actually be more the following year, and they've just come out with a sort of investment plan. So all of these kind of have investment strategies for every couple-year period or 2 or 3 year period. The CPUC one's a little more complicated, but the other ones you can just Google, alternative fuel investment plan or EPIC investment plan or cap and trade investment plan and see kind of the priorities that the state has. And so we're definitely kind of lobbying and advocating for local resources for our community to take advantage of those. And I guess I would just sort of, as a final thought, that a big priority for us that we identified was to not just look at these in the technical sense, but like I said, how do you actually make these things happen as a community, and really kind of diving deep into engaging the community and figuring out, what are the project opportunities, how do we pursue them. It's not really the technological barriers, with a few exceptions, that are in our way. It's more of the economic and social issues that we have to come, and regulatory issues and all those things. And so I'm excited about the fact that the Resource Partnership has this grant with the Strategic Growth Council that can kind of look at some of these, looking at what are our needs, what are the resources available, how might we match up those needs and those resources to meet those. And so hopefully that grant can be a solid next step in kind of moving forward as a region on identifying those opportunities and ways that we can kind of work together. And Mark Lovelace's Venn diagram with all those circles of like, okay, what's in the middle there that we can all focus on and say, hey, let's work on reducing fire, massive fire events and doing biomass energy, and that's a regional issue, and let's collaborate on that. And so hopefully that grant will be a good opportunity to kind of move forward in the next couple years on identifying new priorities for the group. So with that, I think I just hit my mark about, and it's 3 o'clock, so we didn't get out early, but we got out on time.